Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to our number 100 Let's Talk session, which is quite an achievement. So you are here joining us at a very special event, and today we have a very special speaker, Rodrigo, and the event is called Threats and Opportunities for Abruzzo, Europe's most diverse region. I'd like to extend a welcome to those of you who are members joining for the first time and those of you who are non-members. Today we have about 260 members in the UK and around the world. 50% are in the UK. And we now have quite a broad selection of members around the world, comprising of wine writers, broadcasters, educators, and other professional communicators. You can find more information about the circle on our website, or even joining, you can do this online on our website. Now I'd like to hand over to Michelle Shah, who's one of our members who's helping organising these events. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Andrea, and I'm delighted to welcome Rodrigo Redmont, of American origin, but raised in Italy. Rodrigo established the Talamonti estate in 2001 as the latest step in a wine career which has included managing export sales in a number of leading Italian wine estates, including Castello Banfi. Today, Talamonti is considered one of Abruzzo's fastest growing sustainable boutique wineries, exporting an annual production of 200,000 cases to 65 countries. Thank you, Rodrigo, for taking time to be with us today. Over to you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michelle. As I was mentioning earlier on, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually participating in this call all the way from Mississippi, where, as I was mentioning earlier, I just learned that the U.S. dietary guidelines are going to be reviewed by the U.S. Fed. So it's kind of concerning to see that, there's a little bit of a crusade, that is basically being undertaken more and more against alcohol. And this is obviously not the last of the issues we've had over the last few years. But to jump onto the presentation that I have for you today, it's funny that it's the 100th, shall we say, presentation, or here we go. Just a minute here. Okay. For the Circle of Wine Writers, is actually, there's another date which is very important, at least for me today, or at least Monday, because it was the patron saint day of Lorita Prutino, which is the small village where I am from, where there's a very important ceremony, agricultural ceremony, where the castrated bull actually kneels in front of a procession. So it's also the patron saint day for Loretta Prutino. Threats and opportunities of Abruzzo, and the latest threat is the one I just mentioned about the Fed's approach to obviously the dietary guideline. Abruzzo is biodiverse because the National Tourism Association in Italy states that 70% of all the flora and fauna that exists in Europe is present in the Abruzzo region. This is a region that, from sea level to 3,000 meters or 9,000 feet, spans within 80 kilometers. So imagine that there is literally no flat land in Abruzzo. It's practically, I would say, maybe 50% mountains and maybe 48% hills. So it's a very diverse landscape, and 1/3 of the region is obviously covered in national parks. I think there must be 8,000 different species of flora and fauna in Abruzzo. There are 25 national parks. And to give you the data, the more correct data, it's 131 kilometers of coastline, 65% mountain land, 34% hills, and literally 1% flatland. So it's obviously an opportunity because it's an ideal condition for sustainable and organic or biodynamic wine production. Today, that represents about 42% of total production in Abruzzo. And there's certainly the idea to try and move, at least by the Consorzio of Vini d'Abruzzo, towards sort of a New Zealand-like identity of, fully sustainable. The two challenges, I think the greatest two challenges that Abruzzo faces today, and then I'll get into the conversation a little bit further. First of all, is the term Montepulciano, which, keeps on coming back almost with vengeance, every few years, whether it's by the Vino Nobile producers or it's the European Union that requires, obviously, that names of appellations be geographically linked, or whether it is other wine regions, as more recently, who argue that they should be able to utilize the term Montepulciano on their back label, like the Marche region, or that utilize Montepulciano. So this is obviously the big challenge which has been facing, for many years, the Abruzzo region, and which I'll talk more about it. I think the Association of Abruzzo Producers is finally starting to find a solution. And I will talk more about the new Abruzzo model in a few slides. The second issue that we have is that being an intensely agricultural and artisanal area, there are numerous attempts of industrialization in the area. And, this is something which is becoming more and more evident. In the town of Loretta Prutino, over the last 5 years, the group of wine producers, Custodes Laureti, which I'll talk more about later, had to fight back against, biogas plants next to Valentini's vineyards, for example. The desire to put an intensive pig farm next to a 9th century tower, talking about 5,000 pigs. And now the latest desire to try and put what we call primary cabins for electricity, to be able to latch on solar panels on different fields. And we can talk more about this because it obviously touches on sustainability, but there's a lot of numerous threats that different wine regions are starting to have to face, which go beyond simply being able to sell the wine and produce a quality wine, but which orients itself much more on preserving the landscape and the culture. And so these are, I think, the two really greatest the challenges that the Abruzzo has. Now, this is, I think, the moment.
Rodrigo, before you go any further, your presentation isn't on full screen. We can see all the outside edges. You just have to push the one screen.
Thank you. Sorry, I got carried away.
That's it. Lovely. Thank you. Okay.
Now is the time to bash you a little bit. The slide shows the paragraph that is utilized on the WSET level 3 on the left on Abruzzo, and on the right is obviously Hugh Johnson's historical description of the Abruzzo region. So WSET has, one paragraph on Montepulciano. Hugh Johnson in '94 didn't even have half a sentence on Abruzzo. The World Atlas of Hugh Johnson maybe has half a sentence on Abruzzo. The Culinary Institute of America Exploring Wines, 2002, that was published, 3 paragraphs on Abruzzo. And just to mention another one, Doug Frost, who some of you may know, the 2001 book on wine, basically wrote something like, if you go anything further than the Marche South, then you're going into no man's land. So this is what Abruzzo faces, and this is why we like to describe Abruzzo as Italy's best kept secret, because people don't really talk about it. They don't really know about it, and this is why I feel that this presentation today is so important, because there's really a need for us to communicate and also for you to understand more. And I'm not saying that you all have the same idea of Abruzzo as what I mentioned earlier, but this is sort of what we have to face. So I think this informative session is extremely important. The Abruzzo region hosts Europe's southmost glacier, still a glacier today, the Gran Sasso, almost 3,000 meters in height. It also houses the Maiella mountain range southwards, which is 2,700 meters roughly. There's an incredible temperature excursion between the mountains and the sea winds. So that's great for organic and sustainable production. And most important of all, something that wine producers never talk about, the cost of land. The cost of land in Abruzzo is extremely reasonable. You know, Napa may be, I don't know, 500,000 euro for a hectare, I'm estimating. You know, correct me if I'm wrong. Burgundy maybe is 2 million. Barolo maybe is 1 million. When it comes to Abruzzo, we're talking about 50, 60,000 euro. So what that means and what that leads to is a lot more experimentation, a lot more innovation. I mean, I would never experiment with a hectare of Brunello in Montalcino, right? I might do it in Abruzzo. I would never experiment. I would make sure I'm able to retrieve that income. So I think what this leads to is a faster and quicker generational change, which has impacted, I think, what is going on tremendously in the Abruzzo region with so much more individualism. Because as you know, historically, obviously, Abruzzo was governed by co-ops. And I'll talk in a second more about this, but let me talk a little bit about, you know, Montepulciano and maybe a little bit about Trebbiano. You know, there's a lot of information to provide to you, so I'm going to try and touch a little bit on everything, and then you can let me know if you want me to delve in detail into more. So Montepulciano, the term some of you may know, has always been confused with obviously the town of Montepulciano in Tuscany. One is the grape, the other is the town. In Abruzzo, we're lucky enough to have two confusions, because we don't have just the confusion of Montepulciano, we also have the confusion of Cerasuolo, right? There's Cerasuolo di Vittoria in Sicily, like Frappato, and then there's Cerasuolo d'Abruzzo, which is the rosé made in Abruzzo. So, you know, it's like a national holiday in Italy. We always need a national holiday and then a day after a holiday to recover from the national holiday. So Abruzzo has two appellations, obviously, that create confusion. Why is there this confusion? This is my interpretation, right? I'm sure you've heard a number of different interpretations. I'll tell you what mine is. In 1571, I guess the land of Capistrano and Bussi, which is up in the mountains of Abruzzo, was sold by the Piccolomini family, ancient Roman family, who had land in Abruzzo, to Francesco de' Medici. Obviously, the surname, I'm sure, rings a bell to you. And the reason he bought that land was to raise basically the sheep. If you go to Santo Stefano up in the mountains in Abruzzo, you'll see these villages which are built literally to be able to produce wool. You know, they have like alleys where the sheep were laid in and they would be sheared basically along the path and colored. Incredible sights of these medieval hamlets up in the Abruzzo mountains. So they bought the land because they were also traders of wool up in Northern Europe. And obviously they were neighboring lands that had other interests. But Montepulciano, as you know, Vino Nobile di Montepulciano historically was very much enjoyed in a number of different European courts. And so what Montepulciano became known as was a super premium quality wine. It was like, you know, a 90+ rated wine. That's what it was at the time. So anytime you talked about Vino Montepulciano, historically, it was referred to a quality level, right? So I make a Montepulciano quality wine. That was the rationale. So I think that is the misinterpretation that there is when you talk about Montepulciano being connected somehow to Tuscany, because it was more a question of saying in Abruzzo there was a Montepulciano quality level wine that was being made and not a wine from Montepulciano. And this, I think, is important to understand. Could there have been a transfer? Maybe the neighboring, you know, kingdoms or fiefdoms had a relationship. Could be. There could have been a mistake of signs or varieties that were brought. But these are all explanations which, for me, don't find a justification. Rather, the quality level, I think, is more important. So this is, I would say, really, you know, the greatest problem with the confusion. The second is obviously Trebbiano. I think we're still very much on the scratching surface to really understand what the Trebbiano grape is, because as you know, there are numerous different clones. There's Trebbiano Toscano, which is a very low quality clone. And then you have Trebbiano Abruzzese, which actually for us is more related to Bombino Bianco coming from Puglia. At least that's our belief. The acidity levels, the alcohol levels are very different from Trebbiano d'Abruzzo, and especially the aromatics are very different. So we think it's much more connected there. Why is Abruzzo so relatively unknown? First of all, for the confusion that there is with the grape varieties. I think that's obviously, let's just say, how difficult is it to pronounce the name Montepulciano for consumers, right? You can imagine. I always say it's easier to say after the second glass than the first glass. So first of all, the confusion with the pronunciation and obviously the grape variety. Secondly, the isolation. Not many people are aware that the Gran Sasso Tunnel, which connects Rome to Pescara, that where there's also a lab for nuclear science, was actually completed in 1984. And that was half of it that was completed. The second half, which exits in the Aquila region, was completed in 1995. This was a tunnel that was started in 68. So the connection between the west coast and the east coast of Abruzzo is extremely recent. And so obviously, if you add that to the poverty and the isolation after the wars of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, if you add that to the two earthquakes that we had in 1703 and 1706, which were very strong, if you add the Gustav line during Second World War, and you add the massive migration that people from Abruzzo undertook after the Second World War, and the split of the region, because as you know, after the 40s, Lazio took part of Abruzzo, and then in the 60s, Abruzzo and Molise were split. That's why the name you find in books, sometimes the Abruzzi as plural, and then all of a sudden it becomes Abruzzo, singular. I don't know if you ever wondered why there's this difference in publications. It's because it used to be more than one Abruzzo, and then it became an only Abruzzo, right? So the area shrunk, and that's why it went from plural to singular. So confusion with the grapes, the isolation, and then the third, I think, important aspect is co-ops. Now, I'm not going to bash on co-ops. That's not my style. I'm not going to say co-ops are bad and they're terrible. There's some extraordinary co-ops, for example, in northern Italy that produce some extraordinary quality. Co-ops bring a lot of good in the sense that they bring a lot of modern technology. The problem is that they bring a lot of standardization, not because just the way they work, but they pull grapes from all different parts of the region and just blend them together. And so if you figure that in Abruzzo we have 300 wineries and 6,000 grape growers, you can imagine the level of standardization. 80% of the production, by the way, is co-op based. And some of it is shipped as bulk wine. And I'm going to talk to you about the new Abruzzo model and how we're going to try and fix that, by the way. So obviously, the standardization that was necessary, because I can assure you that, to put 6,000 grape growers, in agreement. Actually, in Italy, we say 6,000 grape growers and 6,000 partners that they have. That's 12,000 people you have to put in agreement, basically, right? Husband and wife. Obviously becomes very, very complicated. This year, for the first time, there's a very exciting, this year, since 2022, there's a very exciting new development that's really being undertaken in Abruzzo. And I think that for the first time, we're starting to see really custodians of tradition taking the lead. I'm going to, maybe exaggerate, but as you said, Michelle, I was in Montalcino in 96. And believe me, it feels very much like Tuscany and Montalcino in the 90s. And I'll tell you why. Super Tuscans were released starting in the 60s, you know, Sassicaia, then in the 70s, I guess, Tignanello, Ornellaia came in the 80s. And it took them about, you know, 10, 20 other years before the publication started to promote how extraordinary these wines are. I feel that there's a very similar environment which today the Abruzzo is facing, because for the first time, what we are doing is we're starting to seek these special and unique zones where terroir-driven wines can be produced. So we're starting to pull away from that, you know, generic wine which was produced in Abruzzo, and we're really starting to see some very unique and very diverse wines being produced, which is the nature of this environment. Like I said, 1/3 of the region covered in national parks, and 3,000 meters of, you know, height change in 80 kilometers. So very important to understand that. So what's going on in Abruzzo? You know, let me explain to you. The objective that the Abruzzo region has is within 2-3 years to finally be able to produce for the Riserva and all Superiore wines, wines that are exclusively bottled in Abruzzo, in the area of production. Not in the area of Abruzzo, but in the area of the sottozone, as we call them, the provincial areas that are part of the DOC. Today, the only wine that can be bottled, that has the obligation to be bottled in the area of production, is the Abruzzo DOC, which is the DOC which allows other varieties to be blended like international varieties. And the reason for that is that the co-ops weren't interested in it, and so obviously they didn't create any issues in that decision. But the objective that there is today to try to from my perspective, it's to sort of unite under a common identity the Abruzzo region, but celebrate the diverse terroirs. So the objective is to create one IGT, Terre d'Abruzzo. This will be released already next year. So all the different IGTs that were produced are going to be slowly eliminated. And there's going to be, like in Tuscany, there's going to be an IGT Terre d'Abruzzo. First simplification, which is extraordinary, because from a communication standpoint, it makes things so much simpler. The DOCs will continue to be there, but they will create sub-areas for the Riserva and the Superiore classification. And so what I believe you will start to see is wines that are bottled outside of the area and locally as generic, and then you'll start to see the Superiores and the Riservas being bottled exclusively in the area of production. And this is very important because, as you know, a large chunk of the production is bottled outside of the Abruzzo region. And this is going to give a stronger identity, and it's going to simplify the communication, which is going to be, I think, great. Just to give you another quick fact, you may not know, but the aging process of Riserva for Trebbiano is 18 months, and for Montepulciano it's 2 years, of which 9 months in wood. So those are the aging obligations. So the objective again is simplification, as I said, and the desire to be able to bottle locally everything, because today the DOC appellations only require the aging and the bottle rest and the vinification locally. They don't require the bottling locally, which is the greatest challenge that we have. So this is an attempt to change basically the regulations from that perspective. Let's talk a little bit about climate change impacts, and why do I think that Abruzzo is really one of the most apt areas to face this. If you take a look at the chart on the left, it's a very interesting chart. This refers to one of Valentini's single vineyards. I'm sure you're all familiar with who Valentini is. I don't think I need to explain to you, one of the most important wine producers. He's been producing wine since the 17th century, regularly considered to be one of the top white wine producers in Italy, you know, and not just white wine. With the University of Chieti, he shared basically all the data that he had in his hands, because historically the family has always noted the harvesting start date and the temperatures. And so this is very interesting, because this shows you the shift that we have experienced. And, you know, people talk about the heating of the climate. And I think, you know, it's very important to talk also with facts. So you see that over the last 40 years, we've seen a growth of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is locally what we've seen. And this is the maximum temperature, right? During the day, the highest and the lowest temperatures obviously are recorded. The lower temperature is a little bit lower in terms of the temperature growth, but we're talking about roughly over the last few years an increase of 0.1 of a degree Celsius every year. This is what we're facing right now. The interesting thing is that Valentini more or less has not changed any of his vineyard work operations. They're pretty much the same since the 17th, 18th century. And what do we see? What do we see as, you know, aspects that we have to consider? Well, I think first of all, if you look at Huglin's index, you will see where Uni Blanc and where Montepulciano are positioned. So obviously we have, like most Mediterranean grape varieties, we have a greater resistance, without a doubt, to the heat. So I think Abruzzo is going to obviously be able to survive this climate change better than other regions because of that. I think we have, as you see here in the background, we have training methods that are traditional, that are already structured to create more shade and have less heat reflection, right? The pergola training method is an extraordinary training method, which is very good in heat. Also, don't underestimate the importance of the higher yields that we have in Abruzzo, right? Everybody always criticizes the fact that in Abruzzo, the appellations allow 14 tons, 15 tons per hectare, excessive quantity produced. But this is going to be very important for the equilibrium of alcohol and the equilibrium of a number of other parameters. So the fact that these vines have a capacity to, if you want, overproduce or produce quantity, if not managed correctly, leads me to believe that we will be able to attain balance for a longer period. The third aspect, I think, is also the environment we have. You know, the wind and the temperature excursion we have between day and night is so strong that this is obviously very, very important for the slow ripening of the grapes. What else could we do? Obviously, you know, we're working on cover crop. We're working on, you know, better canopy management. We're looking at irrigation. So as a winery, we are already starting to structure the vineyards with, how can I say, the infrastructure to be able to irrigate if we will need to do that, because we don't want to find ourselves in 10 years where all of a sudden we need to irrigate and we don't have the systems and we don't have the lake basins. So this is very important to start looking at that right now, and this is what we're doing. You know, maybe we'll have to choose different crops eventually, but we also have stylistically a wine which is extremely important historically for the region, which is Cirasuolo, the rosé we produce in the area. And not everybody will know, but there are 5 historical rosés in Italy. You know, there are 2 produced in the Veneto region. There's Ciro, which is produced obviously in Calabria. There's obviously Puglia, the famous 5 roses. And then there's Cirasuolo. Cirasuolo is the first DOC classified rosé of Italy. In '68, it was classified as a DOC. The reason for that is that it was a vinification method. Some of you may know that historically, most of the red wine production was up in the mountains in Abruzzo. That's when the harvest was done in November, maybe for red varieties. And obviously what happened was very often the snow would fall and they would have to harvest. And obviously the grapes wouldn't ripen perfectly, so they would do shorter macerations with maybe not fully ripened grapes. And so the consumption of rosé has always been historically a very popular and traditional wine in the area. No better pairing with arrosticini, lamb skewers, than Cirasuolo is my recommendation, by the way. So we also have, stylistically, I think, a very important style of wine which will adapt to this climate change, as we are obliged to harvest earlier in order to not increase the alcohol levels. The economic standpoint, I think everybody that educates is well aware of the economic crisis, if you want, and that has obliterated basically the purchasing capacity of Generation Z and the millennials, the drinking habits. We're seeing a drop pretty much around the world as far as average price point is concerned. We're also seeing different drinking habits. And some of this may be repetitive for you, but you're well aware. I see in my, I'm 50 years old. I see friends of my children, because my children are still young. They're 5, 8, and 10. Yeah, I'm in the middle of a vortex right now. But we see that they are consuming less red wine at the table. They don't like to sit still. I think you've seen that with younger generations. Try having them sit for an hour at the table. They'll never be able to do that, right? So they want a wine or a drink which is, very apt for socializing. And that's white wine and rosé. So I think the consumption pattern is changing. Even in Italy, it's changing. Everybody's doing these aperitivi cenati. They're not, sitting down for a formal meal. They're standing up and they're socializing. And obviously that is pushing also more the consumption of white and rosés. Then you have locally low alcohol. In our case, white wines and rosé wines are lower alcohol than the red wines. So obviously that goes to impact. So I think, from an economic standpoint, we're better poised. Abruzzo, without a doubt, is recognized value. It's environmentally friendly. It's authentic. It's diverse. It's everything that people want today in consumption. So, and it's very export oriented, which obviously is very, very important today for any Italian winery. So I think we're poised both from a climatic standpoint, but also from an economic standpoint, to be able to face basically the changing environment. Now, I don't know if you've seen the latest publication by the OIV on production and consumption. You can find it on internet. It's very interesting. It's showing you the change. This is just one of the many charts that they're obviously publishing that you can see. But what was very interesting for me as a trend was, first of all, a drop in red wine production in general, globally. Today, red wine represents 43%. Incidentally, if I were to ask you whether Italy is a red wine or a white wine producing country, some of you would say red incorrectly. Today, Italy produces 60% white and sparkling. So it's a white wine nation. If you look at France, France is becoming more and more a rosé wine producing nation and consuming. That's all they drink and produce. So I think with the identity that Italy is acquiring in many international markets, with the shift from red to white wine, because if you look at the Western world, United States, Europe, the consumption pattern is clearly going more and more towards white. Where you see the growth of red wine is actually Asia and South America. But all the other countries are shifting and moving, fairly quickly towards white wine. And if you look historically at the nations that are producing white versus red, you'll see that South Africa, historically white wine, starting to produce some red wine. Maybe California, a little bit of white. But if you look at Chile, no doubt that it's more red wine oriented. If you look at Spain, no doubt that it's more red wine, oriented country. So I think Italy, and Abruzzo specifically, has, because of its production and appellations, a more interesting opportunity as far as the change in the global environment. Just a quick, and I haven't kept the schedule on time. I hope I'm more or less on schedule. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Loretta Prutino specifically, and to talk to you a little bit about this association we've created called Custodes Laureti, which I think is very interesting. And then I'll talk to you about the zoning that we have just done. 6 wineries in Loretta Prutino have come together. This is kind of unusual for Italy and for the Abruzzo region in the town of Loretta Prutino. We're all neighbors. We all produce wine in the same southern part of Loretta Prutino. It's Valentini, Torre dei Beati, ourselves, De Fermo, Ciavolic, and Amorotti. These are all, very well recognized premium wineries in Abruzzo and in Italy. And the first time in 2022, we all bounded together because of the challenges we were having in the area. I talked to you about the biogas. I talked to you about the intensive pig farms that they were trying to create. So we all bonded together, and we realized that there was a need to work together to preserve and to protect the landscape and the culture of the area. We also realized that I think you reach a level of maturity as a professional, where at a certain point you realize that you have to continue growing, you have to give back and promote your whole area. And this is basically what we started to do. And I can assure you that to pull together a biodynamic producer, organic producers, sustainable producers, each one of them extremely individualistic for their own reason, was not something simple. And the reason I'm promoting this association is to show you the individualistic nature which is developing in Abruzzo and which is shifting away from that co-op governance. It's not an intention to promote, maybe a little bit our region, but more of all is to show you what is going on in the Abruzzo region and how much this is starting to change. Loretta Prutino has the Presidium of the white bean, the Tondino, is the first DOP classified olive oil in Italy, aside from the great wine producers we have in the area. So from an agricultural standpoint, it has an enormous potential. If you look at the town of Loretta Prutino, we have 26 historical wine cellars or olive oil mills inside the old town, which still exist today, which are being renovated and restructured. And there's an enormous opportunity from a tourist perspective, because we have one of the largest Neolithic villages that have been discovered on one of the hills around Loretta Prutino in all of Europe. And if you go and look on the internet, you'll find all of this information. We have an incredible series of different museums. And the objective that we have will be to promote, obviously, the biodiversity, which is a theme that today is very popular, but which I think is very, very pertinent to the Abruzzo region. And let me show you, I'm going to just shift the different screens that I have. So I can't really talk to you too much about the studies that we are undertaking in Loretta Prutino, because the book will be presented in late July. We'll also do a streaming of this. So if any of you want to attend and learn more about it, we'll be happy to share the link. But basically, Gabriele Valentini, who is an agronomist and works with the University of Bologna, which is the oldest university in Italy, no connection to the wine producer. It's a common name in the area. Basically, over the course of a year and a half, identified select parcels of each one of these 6 wineries, all in the southern part of basically the town of Loretta Prutino, and basically did excavations, monitored the temperatures, and researched basically the characteristics of these unique areas in Loreto Abruzzo. So the results are going to be, obviously published, but basically Loreto has a marine soil which was pushed by tectonic plates. And then obviously we have a lot of residue coming from the mountains during the de-icing. And what that created basically was a lot of streams and a lot of rivers. And so the Tavo River is an extremely important river which has created different terraces with different layers of different composition. And this is what is going to be presented as a study. Obviously, this is a first step. Maybe there'll be micro vinifications that will follow. But what I wanted really to promote and to explain to you is that you're going to start seeing clusters develop in Abruzzo to try and promote the unique terroirs that these, different winemaking areas have. And I think it will be very interesting for you to see how Abruzzo grows, because for me, Abruzzo today is what I would compare to a gentrified neighborhood. It's an area which has already changed. There's been growth in quality, but I don't think it's yet perceived, certainly from a pricing perspective, but also from a general market perspective. And I think you will start to see this in the coming years. And it will be very interesting to monitor and see how the Abruzzo region changes and is perceived differently. I thank you for your attention. I tried to touch on a wide range of different points and aspects that touched on the threats and the opportunities. I closed with the opportunity of the different contrade which are being analyzed in Loreto as an example of, I think, what the future holds for Abruzzo. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to try and answer each one of them. Thank you.
Rodrigo, thank you so much. This is Meg Maker. Andrea actually had to step out. She's been having some computer trouble during the webinar. So our apologies, but you have me now. I don't see actually any questions in the chat, but I have a question for you. As a writer and a fellow American, and I agree that Montepulciano is an incredibly confusing term. And I'm wondering if and what the producers are doing about trying to either shore up their own brand or use a different term, or what are you doing from a communications perspective? And I actually might suggest that you stop sharing your screen so we can see your smiling face a little bit more fully. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's I think these subzones which are going to be more and more evident is what you're going to start to see on the labels in a more prominent way, because I think it will solve the issue of the term Montepulciano in different ways. Mm-hmm. So you're going to start seeing, and obviously this is the start. So the start is always going to be confusing and then it's going to simplify. But initially you're going to have, for example, in our area, you're going to start seeing Colline Pescaresi as the appellation, the Pescara Hills. You're going to start seeing the Terre Aquilane. And so it's going to be more of a geographic term, which is going to be utilized. They will also have to include initially the term Montepulciano, but I see the term Montepulciano with a limited lifespan. I see the term Montepulciano, my or the future generation, having to go without, because I see also with the climate change, more and more people starting to plant Montepulciano, and that will create an issue like it did with Prosecco, like it did with Tokai, like it did with a number of other appellations. So I think there's a need not only from a pronunciation, but also from a, how can I say, protective perspective to change that. So hopefully, Colline Pescaresi will be sufficiently simple for the consumer. We obviously work with fantasy names and we promote the brand of the winery. But, obviously this takes a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. It shifts slowly. Michelle had another question. Michelle, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thanks, Meg. Yes, well, as you know, I'm all keen about old vines, and I know Abruzzo still has a fair amount of old vines that categorized above the age of 35 years, and many are still planted to that traditional method, pergola method, yielding lower yields. So my question to you, Rodrigo, is do you think producers are aware that their old vines that they might have are often more resilient to the climate extremes? Do you think they appreciate this and therefore they keep their old vines?
So, there's never black and white answer to any question. It's a good question. We have a 50-year-old vine on our estate, which is Pergola train, which is actually very similar to what we have here in the background. But obviously the trunks are much thicker, and we don't uproot them because they have an incredible quality level. I think the problem we face is these vineyards need to be manually managed, and nobody wants to work in vineyards. That's the challenge we have. The climate is changing so fast. We had this year, for the first time, hail at 18 degrees Celsius. That's for us something incredible. Normally it's 24, 25. So I don't even know how to forecast the bad weather that's coming at this point if we get hail at 18 degrees Celsius. Last year, what happened to Abruzzo. We had Pronospera. Was an emergency. I think our neighbors lost even 95% to disease. The year before that, we had drought. The year before that, we had drought. So it's challenging. I think what we have chosen is to diversify as much as we can, not put all eggs in one basket, but try to do Guyot style and to do pergola training methods. We're doing it on white and we're doing it on red. There's no doubt that from a quality perspective, pergola is better. If I look back 25 years on the quality of the color intensity, the aromatic composition, the elegance of the wines, no question, it's a much slower ripening. So I think there is appreciation for the older vines. I just think the lack of labor is becoming, a very big issue for us. And I don't know how we will face it, if not with some sort of mechanical approach. But we amongst neighbors, we talk, and there's some activities in the vineyards you can do a week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. But then there's some activities that if you don't act on the moment, on the spot, you risk your entire crop. So kind of have to weigh and leverage the two things and then find a solution. So yeah, Valentini is all pergola. If you look at Amarotti, I would say half is pergola. If you look at Chavolik, also a big chunk is pergola. If you look at De Fermo, he's all Guyot. So I think it varies. But yeah.
It would seem that the terrain would resist any kind of mechanization. That mechanization generally, regardless of whether it's pergola or trained on Guyot, would be very, very challenging. And also on top of that, you have the fact that you have so many co-ops. So I'm assuming based on that you have many, many smaller producers with very tiny plots. So you mentioned at the start of the talk about more just privatization and estate bottling, and moving away from co-ops. How does that actually work in practice? What's actually happening there?
So I think you've seen over the last 20 years, especially in the mountain areas, you've seen a lot more development and emergence of small family farms. And so because of the lower cost of land, you've seen a lot of people sort of experiment and delve into production. The reason for that is also that co-ops don't pay a lot of money for the grapes. And so obviously it's not economically viable for people to do something like that. So I think there's a push. You obviously have to start slow and obviously build your own cellar and do the vinification. So it's very high capital intensive. Abruzzo is part of the southern part of Italy, so there are some incentives from the European Union to be able to make those investments. Italy obviously promotes below 40 capital investments by entrepreneurs. So if you're young, there's additional investments. And if you're female, there's even more investments. So I think the structure is correct and is right. What we need, though, is for the young generations also to go to school and also learn more, and not just hands-on, but also more theoretical. That's, I think, the need that we have. You have to delist yourself from a co-op to be able to produce, because it's annual contracts that you sign, and it's very difficult to pull away. I think in the long run, from a climatic point of view, you will see that the vineyards that are located higher up in the mountains, which is the natural area for these vineyards, are going to resist better this climate change. What we saw also last year with the Pronospera, it was the vineyards that were located more in the Chieti area, more closer to the sea, which maybe traditionally were not necessarily the areas where vines were planted. It's kind of interesting. The earth responds that way, you know? If it's not supposed to be planted there, Mother Nature is gonna pound with stronger impact. So we're also seeing that. And we're having to climb obviously higher in terms of altitude to be able to resist this climate change. I think also there's a need for a network between wine producers. There needs to be much more team play and much more communication. And this is going to take time in Abruzzo. But hopefully we'll lead with example.
Yeah, excellent.
I think, as far as mechanization is concerned, we work with precision farming on our estate. So obviously we have, huts, we have water evaporation forms of control. We have also for the pests, we have systems that basically, like a phone, basically, once upon a time when you used to collect the flies and the tignola, the little butterflies that used to be an issue in the vineyards, we would basically use the sticky paper like you used to have, you would see in the movies in Australia, to collect the flies. Then that evolved, and today what we have is basically like these phones that basically have a sticky surface, and then you can read all the different traps throughout the winery and have immediate information. So that doesn't go to say that technology is going to replace the human component of it, but it's additional information that you can utilize to make your decision, right? You still have to go out and taste the grapes. You're not only going to base your decision of when to harvest on pH, acidity, and sugar level, right? So it's the same concept applied to fighting off disease and pests. I think I went off on a tangent, but
Go ahead, Michelle, please.
I was just going to wrap up and thank Rodrigo so much for that very enlightening presentation, touching on so many aspects of the region. And as you know, I've been lucky to visit Abruzzo on several occasions, and it's really a spectacular region with such biodiversity and diverse landscape. I also think that today Abruzzo produces some really quality-driven wines, and I hope everyone gets a chance to visit the region sometime, and especially Loreto Abruzino. So thank you, Rodrigo, for being with us today, and thank you, everybody, for being also present with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to all. Ciao.
Ciao. Bye-bye.